Good morning, everyone. My name is Kelsey O'Shea. I'm the Ag Business Management Specialist for the North Country Regional Ag Team. This is a team that covers 6 counties in the North Country that was started just about almost 2 years ago now. And my job primarily is working with farmers on anything that's not actually related to farming. So accounting, taxes, transfer and estate planning, labor, some regulatory issues as it relates to labor and taxes. And I'm here today to talk about basically your role as feeders on the farm and what impact that can have on the bottom line, and also some critical decision making and planning tools. I went to Cornell University. I graduated in 2012 with a degree in agribusiness management and animal science. I'm not from a dairy farm. I'm from San Diego. I grew up 10 minutes from the beach, had nothing to do with cows or anything like that. So I learned everything I know from university and life experience after that. Afterwards, right after school, I went to work for Farm Credit East for 4 years. I spent about 3 years managing a $20 million portfolio, and then a few years at the end doing more taxes and consulting, business planning type stuff. So about 2 years ago, I decided to make a change and come to Extension when they formed the Northern New York Regional Ag Team, and been doing that ever since. So I will preface this presentation with saying nothing in here is going to be completely groundbreaking or totally amazing, earth-shattering. This is kind of logical stuff. But the point is for you guys to really take some time and think about it. I know your days are really hectic. I know working on the dairy farm, you're making millions of snap decisions a day. The point is to take some time and think about what you're really doing and seeing if you can actually make your job better, how we can make ourselves more efficient. It's not something we take time to do very often, but obviously you guys have the good sense to come to this thing and start there. So what I'll be talking about today, the first thing is kind of the statistics of feeding. So purchase feed expense is about 36% of total operating expenses on the farm. So about 1/3 of all of your operating expenses goes to that item that you're handling every single day, the item that we're talking about today, to feed. It's the single largest expense on a dairy farm. According to a study in 2016, feeding takes up about 7.7% of total labor hours. So this one really gets me. I'll throw this out there by saying my husband owns a dairy farm. So I watch him do that every day. That number always kind of shocks me. I feel like we're trying to squeeze feeding in between everything else. And to think that it takes up about 7.7% is a lot of your day, actually. So shrink from the bunk to the front of the cow on the average farm is anywhere from 5 to 15%. This is another number that I get a lot of pushback on. So this is actually from a study. So I'm not talking about bunk shrink. I'm not talking about losing stuff on the road. I'm talking about when you bucket it out of whatever type of storage you're using and getting it to the cow, 5 to 15%. Does that seem like a lot? It kind of does, right? A little bit. Most people, when I do Dairy Profit Monitor monthly monitoring system with farmers, they're like, maximum 5%. Maybe. Most farms are really closer to 10, really, unless you have some serious equipment and some really awesome protocols in place. This is not the end of the world. It's just something we have to deal with, right? I mean, there's always going to be mud. There's always going to be problems. We're never going to get rid of all shrink altogether. It's just something we need to account for accordingly. So a recent study was done to look at the actual activity of feeding. This was done with Jason Carses and Ashley Howlett out of Pro Dairy at Cornell University. So on this study, there were 26 farms that they took account for all of the feeding activities. The average herd size was about 1,200 cows. There was obviously a range from about 500 cows to about 2,400 cows. And this does include all tons fed to cows and heifers. So in this study, basically what they wanted to look at what it was costing per ton to deliver the feed. Now, I'm not talking about putting the feed up. I'm just talking about mixing, loading, delivering. That's it. So on this study, obviously the average tons varied a little bit depending on the farm size, but the average tons per day was about 88 wet tons of feed. So in this study, they found that operating costs made up 74% of total cost, with labor being the single largest. So when you're looking at just the activity of feeding, and this includes cost of ownership of the equipment, don't forget that. So the biggest expense is still the labor and man hours you're putting into it. So as awesome as it is to have brand new equipment or really big equipment, your greatest expense still comes down to people and efficiency and doing the job right. So on top of this, the take home really from this study, because there's a lot of interesting things that you can kind of glean from this, but really the take home was the more efficient you could be, the bigger you could make your loads, the better you performed in cost per ton, right? So that's kind of logical. So if we have some bigger equipment, we only have to put it in once, we're not driving to and from the bunk, that sort of stuff. And ultimately to reduce labor. So this is a chart from that study. The total cost per ton of loading, mixing, and delivering feed. Again, it breaks it out by operating costs versus ownership costs, and then obviously various farms depending on where they performed. So what I really got out of this is, if you look, this is, you know, the best performers, right? The 3.15 per ton. Those are the guys doing it the most efficiently. Now, I guess the poorest performers were at 8.16. That's a $5 per ton range. That is enormous in the world of finance. That's a lot of money. And then looking at the average. So the average is actually the variation between the best and the worst. So basically, that being said, I recognize that there are a million different ways to get cows fed. Okay, and everybody does it a little bit differently, and half the time you're sort of just saddled with what you got from whoever was there before you. So that being said, I recognize that there's some limitations, but given that there's such a wide range, there's a lot of room for improvement that may not necessarily involve spending a ton of money. So obviously the list of people I trust to feed my cows. This is a really important job. Why does it matter? So the health of the cows obviously depends on it. Your actions directly impact the largest expense on the dairy. So I can't hit home enough for that. I know feeding can be a very difficult job, a very frustrating job, especially, you know, usually when you're getting to a facility, it may not be set up the way you think it should be. But realistically, what you do every day impacts the bottom line of dairy farms very, very much so, in a big way. It's difficult to balance being efficient and doing a good job, right? I mean, obviously, the faster you go, sometimes the more spill you're going to have, the more you're going to waste, mistakes might be made, and you might end up costing yourself more time than you thought you'd save. And then working with it as a team with other departments is really important. This is another disconnect I've heard from other groups. This is like my 4th or 5th time doing this presentation, is that, you know, as a feeder, you're trying to do one thing, but then the barn crew is thinking something else, and the herd crew is thinking something completely different. And we recognize that everyone's trying to get their job done without getting in anybody else's way, but you got to work as a team to try and get it done the best you can. So I'll give you guys a couple minutes to brainstorm about what factors of an operation or your job in particular would affect feeding. So you can talk with the people at your table. This is kind of nice, there's like 2 tables. So you can talk in small groups, big groups. But what I would want to hear from you guys is, you know, is it facilities? Is it the equipment that you have? Is it that you're understaffed? And, you know, I know there's some kids from SUNY Cobblestone here, so whatever the last dairy farm you worked on, or if you have a dairy farm at home, use those as an example, but take about 2 minutes to just kind of chat with your neighbors. They're fine. Thank you. All right, guys, I'll bring you back really quick. So who can give me a couple of factors that your group discussed or came up with? I know some of them are up there, but talk to me about what's going on at the farms you work at and the farms you own. The weather. The weather is a big thing. I have not heard that one yet, but yes, absolutely. No, I'm all about it. For everyone wondering, yes, that's my car with all the snow on it because I drove from St. Lawrence County this morning. No, it didn't snow anywhere nearby. Don't freak people out. Yeah, absolutely. And totally depends on how your facility's set up too. The weather could affect it a lot more, I guess, than some other facilities, right? Oh, very true. Very true. Yeah. Absolutely. What else have we got? Weather. Sorry, I can't recommend any way to control that. I got nothing for that one. Give me something I can fix. Oh, a lovely feed center. Do you know how many times I've heard this in these discussions? Well, if I could just build a feed center, I'd be fine. Yeah, not everybody has that kind of money right now. Oh, true. Very true. That's a good point. Absolutely. Yeah, so set up a feed center is huge. So I heard someone else, because I'm eavesdropping, talking about travel and just getting from point A to point B to get all your ingredients to one place. Because, you know, a lot of times as dairy farmers, expanding doesn't always mean everything catches up all at once. So a lot of times we'll have expanded cows, we'll have done all these other things, and it's like, well, we're just gonna shove some more feed over here, we're gonna shove a little more over here, and all of a sudden it's kind of spread out all over the place, and we haven't invested in that feed center or our feeding process. So I've heard that a lot. You know, I've heard some guys who are saying, I gotta go from one site to this site. Maybe you're feeding on two separate sites. So time efficiency and location, physical location of the feed can be a problem. And then obviously today too, this will be probably for the school kids too. I'm sure you guys have some consistency in who feeds, but some people really struggle in just the consistency of who's doing the feeding. Who is it? Is it the same person every day? Is it someone these 3 days and another person these 2 days? So sometimes that procedural drift, as we call it, kind of this variation in how things get done causes problems too. Sometimes the job's tough, obviously, trying to work out feed sheets. This is like me trying to use FeedWatch. So what factors can you control? Obviously, it all depends. It depends on the facility you're on, depends on what your role is on the farm. But even as an employee of a farm or a feeder, there's still some things that you can be in control of in your world within your job, or making really good, meaningful suggestions to owners or the school or whoever it is that you're working for really can be helpful in making sure you get things done the way that you should. So identifying what you can control and finding ways to fix it. So when I'm looking at evaluating various factors on the dairy farm, a lot of what I try and do is break it down into groups of things that I can control. So when I'm looking at feeding, there's really three sections of feeding that I'm going to look at critically. So the first one is factors of the farm. So number of cows, delivery system, setup. These are what I would call the big picture items, things that we're not going to change overnight per se. We might be able to make long-term planning to change, but these are the big things. Labor, so all those activities associated with the prepping, mixing, and delivery of feed. And when I talk about labor too, we'll throw procedure in with labor, okay? So the order that you do things, maybe that's become an issue. And then obviously equipment. So mixer, tractor, anything else that you're using, and sometimes equipment can even be a computer program using Easy Feed or Feed Tracker or something like that. So those are the three categories that I'm really thinking about in the context of feeding when I'm looking at a farm's efficiency in this particular area. So with that, how do we evaluate change? There's pre-evaluation and post-evaluation, right? So we just talked about those three different areas of feeding. So in our pre-evaluation, we're gonna pick one of those areas and say, okay, I know I could do better here. What could I change? So like, let's say we're gonna go with procedure, right? I like this one because it doesn't cost any money, right? To just change the order that we do things doesn't really cost us any money, unless we're gonna add extra steps and we have to add labor, but let's pretend for a minute that we're not talking about that. So we're talking about really investing no money, just making some procedural changes. So in our pre-evaluation, we're going to look at, okay, if I switched around the schedule and the way that these guys did things, I think we could get things done 20 minutes faster, okay, per feeding. Let's say I'm going to feed once a day, twice a day, whatever. So we'll say twice a day. That's 40 minutes a day, almost an hour of labor I'm saving every day. Now, am I going to stop paying that person and have them go home an hour early? Or am I going to find something else, something better for them to do with their time? So this is where it gets a little tricky, but that's in that pre-evaluation where we're going to look at all those factors. What's going to happen is, you know, am I making this more efficient? Obviously, you would save me on labor, but am I going to use it somewhere else? Am I going to spend it somewhere else? Am I going to keep that person there? Am I going to lose quality potential of the mix that I'm feeding my cattle? Will I see a drop in milk? Hopefully not. So that's all the pre-evaluation. The post-evaluation is actually going back after we've made a change and saying, did things perform the way I thought they would? This is like the bane of dairy farmers' existence, right? Okay, because you've got about 500 more decisions to make after you made that one. Then we want to move on, make a decision and move on because there's other things to do. So it's really difficult. I struggle with it, and I struggle making sure farmers stay true to it, to do that post-evaluation to say, okay, did this perform like I thought I would? And on top of that, do I continue with the change that I've made, or do I need to change again? Another thing when we talk about making changes and making procedural changes or whatever that looks like, the temptation is always to compare what we have to one other choice. In general and in business, and this is kind of like a new trend, I guess, that really isn't a great decision-making process because in 9 times out of 10, most anything different or bigger or more efficient is going to be better than what you have. So it's always going to look like a good idea to make that change. You should be comparing 2 different systems in comparison to what you have, right? So that way we're looking at what's actually the best, not what's just better than what I have. Because otherwise we get into this fallacy of, all right, I make that choice. And then all of a sudden, well, I really should have done this instead because, you know, my next step is to do this. So, and it's another issue when we experience dairy downturns like this. The temptation is to just plan what I need to get done right now instead of planning what's coming up ahead 5 years out and what really makes sense for that. So again, that's all part of the pre-evaluation, thinking about, all right, if I'm going to make any type of procedural change, I should be comparing it to 2 different options than what I have right now, because most anything is going to look better than what I have now. So pre-evaluation and partial budget, what I'd like you guys to do is take another minute to talk about either a farm you've worked at or the farm that you own. Pick one thing that you would change that would make the feeding position more efficient or more productive or making more milk. Good change, okay? So pick one thing. I'd like everybody to have a factor because there's places for you to write this stuff down. So pick one factor on dairy farm either that you worked on, that you work on now, that you own, whatever it is. So take about 3 minutes to go ahead and get yourselves organized with that one factor. All right. I'll go ahead and bring you guys back. So who can give me a factor that you decided that you would change? One thing that you would change.
Bigger bucket.
Bigger bucket. Cool. I just did bucket measurements the other day, actually. Cost analysis. But anyways, perfect. So that's going to cost you money though, right? So evaluate, we've decided we're going to use this example of a bigger bucket, okay? So it's going to cost us some money. So evaluate who would need to be convinced of this change. Is it owners, employees? Is it other professionals, consultants? Sometimes you get those pesky nutritionists hanging around that might have an opinion about how you feed your cows. I'm just kidding, nutritionists are great. Depending on what type of change you're trying to make, you want to think about those people. Who are you going to have to convince of this? Who are you really going to have to sell it on? And then decide what would make them support this change. Is it improved cash flow, improved efficiency, or improved cow health? So when we talk about a bigger bucket, right? Which one of these three are we probably hitting on there? Probably efficiency, right? Yeah, most likely. Hopefully improved cow health if we're getting more exact measurements, maybe. And then depending on how much efficiency we gain, that might improve cash flow, possibly. So when I'm evaluating these changes, we're not going to work through this in the specifics of dollars and cents, but kind of conceptually. So if we're talking about a new bucket, how much is that going to cost you? What size are you looking for? Take a guess. Give me a number. What would it cost you?
Probably $1,500. All
right. So let's say 2,000 to be safe. We're going to get a top of the line bucket here. So if we're going to do our $2,000 spent on this investment, this is my partial budget. There's positive effects and negative effects. So if we looked on this, just this purchase of a new bucket, right? If we're going to go over to additional revenue, is that new bucket going to make us any more milk? Probably not, right? So we're probably not going to have any additional revenue. Unless, of course, and I have to make this example every time, if you are selling crops on the side, and then obviously less spoilage, there's some other things. But it's not going to make us any more milk, so there's no additional income. So let's go down to reduced costs. What type of reduced costs would I have with this purchase of a new bucket? Labor. So I'm going to have some less labor, right? Am I going to have less fuel? Very good. Depending on size and all that good stuff. It's funny because I was listening to someone talk about hitting potholes and that kind of stuff. So wear and tear on equipment is real as well. So the bigger and more efficient, the less times we have to use it. Jason Carces is looking to do a study on paved driveways alone and justifying that it may actually pay for itself, contrary to what, we've been thinking for the last, forever. The paved driveways are not worth it. But anyway, so saving on labor, we're going to save on some wear and tear on equipment. We're going to save on some fuel. So those would be all of our reduced costs. Now, on our negative effects side, additional cost is obviously the cost of the bucket, right? So when we're doing these kind of evaluations, it's important to decide at the beginning if you're going to evaluate on a monthly basis, for example, or if you're going to evaluate over the life of the asset. So of that bucket, now you'll tell me that it'll last forever. Because every dairy farmer tells me this when we talk about equipment. Oh, it's going to last me 30 years. Yeah, okay. So when we're talking about for this type of stuff, you would want to have it paid back in a very maximum of 7, right? That's usually when the technology is obsolete anyways. And given if we were talking about tractors or mixer wagons or any of those other things that are now completely run by computers, it might actually be like 5 or 4. But if we're talking about 7, if we're going to do it on an annual basis, a monthly basis, or over the life of the asset. So if we're going to do it over the life of the asset, for example, we put that entire $1,500 or $2,000, forgot we're buying fancy bucket, that $2,000 up there. So we put the whole $2,000 there. We'd want to put the entire labor savings over the course of that asset, which would be 7 years of labor savings, 7 years of fuel savings, etc. Because you want to be comparing apples to apples, right? Now, most people are more interested in doing it on a monthly basis because right now, rather than maybe the life of the asset, the more pertinent thing for dairy farmers right now is cash flow on a monthly basis. So if we're going to talk about that, we'd want to divide that cost to that bucket over the 7 years, give it a monthly payment. You may pay for it in cash. Remember that, this is just real world. But if we're talking about spreading it out so it makes sense on a cash flow budget, because obviously just the new bucket is not going to save you more than $1,500 in 1 month, probably. Unless, it might, that'd be great. Definitely buy it, but highly unlikely. So
right. So highly unlikely. So we want to make sure we're comparing apples to apples when we're talking about this type of decision-making process. So anyways, I'd either be putting my monthly payment on my piece of equipment or my total piece of equipment, depending on how I've chosen to evaluate. Now, reduced revenue over here in the negative effects, I don't think it would take away any milk income from us, right? It's not going to make our cows decrease in any way, shape, or form. So I don't think we have to worry about anything in this category. So we're basically comparing that additional cost of the bucket versus the cost savings, right? So the whole point of this is to kind of go through this decision-making process whenever you're thinking about making these procedural changes to feeding. Because again, back to what I said at the beginning, feed is the thing that you're handling, the thing that you're moving and doing and all these things with every day is the single largest expense on the dairy farm. Real things happen when we make changes to how we feed. So what's the bottom line? Did your factor yield a positive net return? If you went through and did all those types of things, ultimately, my guess would be over the 7 years, it's probably break even or even puts you ahead a little bit. How much were those returns? Are they worth it? So what is the non-monetary factor? So let's say our bucket breaks even, okay? Right, so over the life of the asset, the fuel savings, the labor savings, it all works out. So it definitely pays for itself. If it's just break even, is it worth it?
The feeder's happier, yeah.
Boom! Non-monetary effects. So, thank you. I can't stress it enough. I mean, dairy farming is hard. It is very, very difficult. And dairy farmers really do a great job of making sure that everything makes sense on a dollars and cents basis and sometimes forget about those lovely non-monetary effects of like making people's lives better. Because ultimately, there is some monetary effect at the end of the day. If your people are happier, they get their job done in a timely fashion, they're not struggling every day. I mean, there's real monetary effects there. We just don't know how to track them, right? So we're never gonna be able to prove them per se, but the culture on your farm is better, people are happier, cows are happier, everyone's a little bit less stressed. So really putting some stock in the non-monetary effects is important. Again, don't make all your decisions based on making everybody happy, but I like to throw it out there because it's something we kind of forget about as dairy farmers. So the post-evaluation, after I pulled the trigger on my bucket, most times with equipment purchases, we're not going back, right? Because you can't return it. And God knows it depreciated 50% the minute you drove it off the lot. So equipment's not the best example for post-evaluation unless you can trade it in like for a lease. So that's kind of a good option for post-evaluation is when you're leasing and you're looking at either buying out the asset or trading it in. But the post-evaluation is really important, especially when we change like procedural stuff for employees, or if you're recommending a change as an employee to make sure, if you recommended this change to a boss, for example, and it didn't shake out like you thought, you better come forward and say, hey, I thought this was going to help. I thought this was to make us more efficient, but I've been tracking it and it didn't work. Because at least making some sort of change, it might lead you to the right answer. This goes back to evaluating more than one option instead of just something new versus what I already have. So procedural changes, feed center changes too. Again, once you've built a brand new feed center, it's kind of hard to undo it. So the post-evaluation makes the most sense, especially with procedural change, but looking back at your total capital investment is really important, just in case you might invest again. That's the really important part there. So obviously doing all those things, this is the hardest part. And it definitely takes time and effort. So Rome wasn't built in a day. The feeder's job is really tough because usually changes you make to the feeding procedure take time, right? It takes time to see those impacts. It takes time to see if it changes maybe, the quality of your feed, if you're going to see an increase in milk, if you're going to see people be happier, or sometimes even reducing labor takes time. So if we implement even new, bigger equipment, we may still have that extra labor while we're kind of figuring out the procedure and while your employees are figuring it out. So these things don't happen overnight, and it seems to be with feeding too. My guess would be anywhere from 3 months to 6 months minimum to see actual changes in the monthly budgets. But that's like anything for cows, and sometimes you could argue that it takes a whole lactation cycle. So sometimes those non-monetary factors have real value. But the point of this discussion is to get you guys thinking critically about how how you look at feeding, how you do your job every day, taking a minute and saying, all right, well, I've done it this way forever, but what if I did it this way? And that's sort of the point of this, to give you some structure to kind of think about your job in. And I will answer any questions if there are any.